Good morning. Good morning. It's a beautiful spring morning. Rebirth is in the air. Welcome to the final lecture for the King Institute for Faith and Culture this academic year. I want to thank you all for your participation and support for this year, and I look forward to seeing you next year when we start a totally new program. Today, I am very pleased to bring up our friend and philanthropist, intellectual, Renaissance man, Roger Leonard, to introduce our speaker today.
Good morning, everyone. It's a beautiful spring day, and it's been an exciting time here on campus, particularly with the inauguration of President Whitaker. So that was a really wonderful time. So, we are so pleased to have you on our campus. You're making a big difference, not only on this campus, but our community. Let's do something that we rarely do. Let's give the president of King College a round of applause. So. And as a Navy captain in true fashion, he saluted me. So anyway, this is a real pleasure, folks, particularly for students here in the audience. It's a real pleasure for me to introduce my friend, mentor, and Duke Divinity School advisor, Norman Wirzba. He's a wonderful human being, and I can say much more about that later. But he's one of those people, one of those handful of people that in my life changed and formed me, which is really kind of hard to do when you're a 50-year-old greedy capitalist. But, there's just a handful of people in your life that really do have a remarkable influence on you, and Norm is one of those people. And I share that with you because, you're here at King being formed in a particular way because this is a particular place. And you have mentors here on the faculty who are changing your lives. And, it's time for you to think about, as this is going to be profound, but in the very near future, it's going to be your turn to impact other people's lives. That's why you're here and you're being formed in the way you are. And so as you're hearing Dr. Wirzba speak today, I want you to reflect on the fact that one day, many of you will be like him. You'll be in front of students or other people and be influencing them in the way they think. So that's a very important thing for you to begin reflecting on, because King is a place that builds leaders for the future, or forms leaders for the future. So I want to share a passage because not only, I didn't realize, quite frankly, how famous Norman was when I was his student at Duke, until I came back for a meeting I'm United Methodist, so I was at a Board of Ordained Ministry meeting for pastors from Radford, Virginia to Chattanooga, Tennessee. And word got around that I was a student of Dr. Wirzba's at Duke. And all of a sudden I had all these pastors surrounded me saying, "What is he like? What is he like?" That's when I first realized how well known and he was. He is one of the world's leading creation theologians. But I'll have to say, when he was an undergraduate like you, I do know for a fact that one time he took a cockroach and zapped it in a microwave just to see what would happen. So anyway, but he's a very human person. He comes from Canada, and he brings a very unique perspective. But he's also a guy who really talks a lot about love. His latest book is The Way of Love: Recovering the Heart of Christianity. And there's in the first part of the book, there's a paragraph that really just leapt out at me, and I'll share it with you. This book is an account of how love gives shape and direction to Christian faith, and how this faith helps us live better. With the word better, I mean to encompass a lot. A life that is more honest with life's difficulty and potential, more beautiful and worthy of respect and celebration, because it honors and nurtures the potential blessing latent within everything. More responsible because it acknowledges and seeks to correct the injustices in our world. More meaningful because it affirms creatures as gifts worthy of our attention and cherishing. And more hopeful because it is inspired by the divine love that first brought this world into being and that promises to bring an eventual end to its suffering and pain. Christianity deserves consideration because it gives one of the most illuminating and compelling accounts of life and love ever produced. So today's lecture is going to be about food and faith, but it's going to be about something much deeper than that. It's going to be about creation and love. And it's about this love that we receive from God and that we are called to share with others. So that's something for you to reflect on in this really important part of your life as you are preparing to go out into the world and be leaders yourselves. So by way of biography, Norman Wirzba pursued research and teaching interest at the intersections of theology, philosophy, ecology, and agrarian environmental studies. He lectures frequently in his native Canada and the United States. His work focuses on understanding and promoting practices that can equip both rural and urban church communities to be more faithful and responsible members of creation. Current research is centered on a recovery of the doctrine of creation and a restatement of humanity in terms of its creaturely life. He's written a number of books, but he also serves as general editor of the series Culture of the Land, a series in the New Agrarianism, published by the University Press of Kentucky. And he's also co-founder and executive committee member of the Society for Continental Philosophy and Theology. So please welcome my friend, Norman Wirzba.
Well, good morning. First of all, I want to thank folks who brought me here. This is wonderful to come to King and to see this campus and to see this place that Roger's been telling me about. And it's so wonderful to be introduced so warmly. So thank you, Roger. Do you know that you are in one of the biggest human experiments in history? By this experiment, what I mean is that you all are living in a context in which, for the most part, you don't know the conditions that make your life possible. Because we as people today live primarily in the world as shoppers. How many of you built your own house? How many of you make your own clothing? How many of you provide the energy you need to fuel your way through life? How many of you grow your own food? Oh, a few hands went up, good. I've just described to you some of the things that you need to live, and yet most of us don't have a clue about how what we need to live comes to be. Do you realize that this is utterly new in the history of humanity? If we went back even 100 years ago, you would have found that most people knew what it takes for them to live every day, because they were involved in the production of their own food, they were involved in the production of their own energy. Whatever they needed to make it through life, they made. And the things that they made, they understood in terms of their location in a world. But we're totally new because everything that we need, we buy. Now, when you add to that the fact that our shopping happens in what is, I think, pretty clearly the most anonymous economy we have ever seen, that adds to our profound ignorance. Many of us don't know what it takes to grow food. And so we have what I consider to be one of the most narrow and naive food imaginations. And so what I want to do is I want to start by first of all having us think a little bit more about this reality called food. We could do this with a number of other things too, including energy and things of that sort, but I want to focus on food because all of us eat. I hope all of us love to eat. Anybody not love to eat? I know this is a little bit tricky because sometimes people have a love-hate relationship to food. I grew up in a household where food was really good. It was really important. I was a farm kid, so we grew a lot of our food. And I loved it. I have a tradition of German baking. So cake, I love it. It's so good. But I also know that for some people, food is the enemy. Because our food system has been transformed in such a way that we now know that food, particular kinds of food, can kill us. We worry about things like cholesterol, fat content. I have to worry about it because I don't have the kind of physical activity that burns a lot of the calories. So if I keep eating Prinzregententorte every day, I'm going to be 350 pounds. So we've become a food culture in which many of us are afraid of food. We have to diet because we know so many of the calories we're consuming are not good for us. So how do we start to think about food? What is food? Some of us are worried about food because we know that our population, which is roughly about 7 billion now, is projected to grow to maybe 10, maybe 11 billion people. And so politically, we know there's a lot of concern about how are we going to produce enough calories to feed everybody. It's a major question. So some people argue that the most important thing that we can do is just increase the number of calories we're producing right now so that everybody in the world can be fed. Is that the solution? We'll talk a little bit about some of that tonight, so if you want to come back. So what I want to do this morning is first start by increasing, growing, expanding your food imagination. I want to start with a piece of food that I'm hoping many of you know and love, apple pie. I love apple pie. But how does apple pie come to be? The saddest thing when you have a narrow, naive food imagination is that when you take a bite of apple pie, the only thing you're thinking about is what's on your plate. But when you think about apple pie, what you have to do is you have to look beyond the plate to a much, much bigger world. A world in which there are life and death dramas going on all the time. Because what I want you to realize is that when you bite into a piece of apple pie, you're not just biting into that piece of apple pie, you're biting into the whole world. Now you're freaking out, right? What could we possibly mean by biting into the whole world? Well, let's start by asking, what do you need to have so that you can even have apple pie? Obviously, you need apples. And to have apples, you have to have apple trees. And since we're in spring, you have to have a spring in which you don't have a late frost. Because what happens if you have a late frost? Anybody know? You don't have apples, okay? Now you're all sad. I am. Because can you imagine a world without apples? That's mildly terrifying. But you have to understand there is that vulnerability. Now, in a global economy, of course, if you have a frost here in Tennessee, it's okay because we'll get our apples from Michigan or China or wherever. But if you're thinking about apples, you start by thinking about apple trees and what you need to have in terms of weather so you can just have apples. But of course, the trees, they don't just exist in the air. Trees have roots that go into the ground. So when thinking about apple pie, you better be thinking about soil. And some people who have had me as a teacher, Todd Edmondson sitting over there, he knows that I think soil is incredible. And this is what the history of humanity has always known. Because if you don't have healthy soil, you don't have anything. Because everything depends on soil. Which is why when you go into the Bible, one of the first creation stories is in the Garden of Eden, and what you discover is a God on God's knees kissing soil. Go read the story. Soil is utterly fundamental because it's in terms of soil that all the plant and animal life and the human life are possible at all. So what is soil? And here's the thing, we don't exactly know. Hans Jenny, one of the great soil scientists of the last century, spent his entire life, 60 plus years, studying soil. And at the end he said, soil's a mystery because we don't know where the biotic and the abiotic actually occur. Is it an organism? Hard to say. But we do know that it's teeming with billions of microorganisms. And soil is that place where we have to understand that it isn't simply dirt that we walk on. Soil is that life and death matrix where food comes out and death is welcomed. The poet Walt Whitman asked once, why are we not overcome by the stench of death? We should be. Because the plant and animal bodies that make up what's going on around our world, they all go back into the ground because death is received in the soil. And there it's transformed into the possibility of new life. So soil is no small thing. And the question is, what are we doing to our soil? How are we facilitating this hospitable welcome of life and death that then makes possible the nurture of our life going forward? So spend some time with soil because soil is precious. But of course, that's just the beginning when you think about apple pie. We're still talking about apple pie. So you got this tree and you got soil. How do they connect? Well, it's called roots. Roots are incredible, people. Think about a single rye plant, just one. If it's growing in healthy soil, in the course of 3 months, something like 700 miles of root development will develop. Think about that. If you add the little hairs, we're talking thousands of miles. Now, what's going on here? Why do the roots expand and grow and proliferate like this? It's because plants want to have a conversation with soil. It's not a verbal conversation, it's a chemical conversation. And what we know is that the health of that one rye plant depends upon the diversity and the extent of all the root interaction that happens. Healthy soil produces plants that are healthy. One of the reasons some of our fruits and vegetables don't have any taste anymore is because they don't have intense root life. The flavor in your food is a feature of the health of the soil that takes up all these minerals. So for us to have apple pie, you got to have trees that have good roots that are growing in soil that is also alive with all of the billions of microorganisms. But that's just part of this apple pie, because then you also have to have farmers who take care of these trees. Because apple trees, any of you tried to grow apples? Right? You discover pretty quickly that apples don't just happen. Trees need pruning. And then, of course, what we have to figure out is, what about all those animals that want to eat the apples? When you go into a grocery store, do you look for the apples that have all the little holes in them because other bugs have been trying to eat them? No, we tend not to eat those. We want to eat the ones that don't have any blemishes at all. But you have to ask yourself a question. If no insect wants to eat the apple, why do we? Well, the reason the insects won't eat the apple is because they've been sprayed with poison. So they don't eat it. or if they tried to, they died. But we want to eat those. What's wrong with us? This is not an argument for blemished apples, by the way. So you got to have farmers who figure out how to grow apples without putting poison everywhere that kills the insects, that kills the microorganismic life in the soil, that is doing a lot of damage to us who eat these apples. But then you also have to think about bakers. I'm sure some of you have had an apple pie that you bite into and you say, well, that's a disappointment. Why? Well, because the apples don't have a lot of flavor, and you sense that the only way you would continue to eat this is because there's a lot of high fructose corn syrup in that soup that surrounds the apple slices. And you discover that maybe the crust is not very flaky at all. And you think, wow, where was the expertise in the crust? Because to have a pie baker who knows how to take apples and make a flaky crust, and then we add the mode, the a la mode. It's a flavor explosion in your head. It's fabulous. So now think about this piece of apple pie with the flaky crust and the tasty apples and the memory of bakers who have the skill to produce that apple pie, and the farming communities that know how to grow apples without killing everything using poison. And you're thinking about a tree that has vibrant roots going into the ground in deep conversation with soil which is teeming with life. Do you see that behind every bite of food are multiple stories that connect you to everything else in the world? Apple pie has never simply been apple pie. And that's why apple pie is so incredible. With this very brief vignette, does it make sense any longer to call food simply a stockpile of commodities? Is it just a lump of calories? One of the ways that has been very destructive in our food imaginations is that we have been taught to think about food primarily as fuel. It's the stuff that we go into a store and we purchase, right? You go into a grocery store, the shelves are always full, and it's mostly attractively packaged, and the price is pretty cheap. Because when you think about food primarily as a commodity, the only things that matter really is the food available? Is the food cheap? And does it have pretty good taste? But why should we think about food that way, simply in terms of commodity? Because what I hope you're beginning to sense is that food is never simply a commodity. Food is, in fact, a gift. Food is something that we have to figure out how we're going to cherish, because if we can't learn to cherish our food, we're going to have a lot of time, or a lot of difficulty, I think, trying to cherish farmers, bakers, land. So let me do a little experiment to help you see how the naming of our food really matters. Because if we name it as a commodity, we're going to treat it one way, whereas if we name it a different way, we'll have a very different kind of attitude. So imagine that I'm holding a plant in my hand right now. What if I tell you this is a flower? What's your response to seeing a flower? Well, I hope your response is, I want to behold it. Maybe I want to come close enough that I can even smell it. Because flowers are the sorts of things that are beautiful. Now I come to you and say, but wait a minute, I made a mistake. This plant, it really isn't a flower. What it is a weed. Now what are you thinking about this plant? Some of you are smiling because you want to kill it. And why do you want to kill it? Because weeds steal the sunshine. so we kill weeds. But then I say, oh, no, I made a mistake. It's not a flower, it's not a weed. What I'm holding in my hand is a tomato plant. Now what are you thinking? Well, hopefully you're thinking, if I take care of this tomato plant, and by that I mean, right, I tie it as it gets taller, I sucker it as it grows, and then I tend to those little balls that start out as green, and then they get pink, and then they get red. And if I take care of this plant, there will be a time when I will go to that red fruit and I will pick it, and I will cut it into slices, and I will put it on a baguette with some cheese and some pesto, and I'll have bruschetta. Wow. So now you're not going to kill it. You're not just going to look at it. You're going to take care of this plant. Now notice, one plant, 3 different ways to name it. A flower, a weed, a vegetable. Each of those namings caused you to think about this plant in dramatically different ways. So the naming of something like our food matters. If we think about food primarily as a commodity, if we think about food primarily as fuel, the way we are going to connect to it is by just asking, how do I get it as cheap as possible? How do I make sure it's always going to be in the store? And that's the end of it. But what if we think about food differently? How might Christians think about food differently? Well, rather than thinking about food as a commodity, I want you to entertain this possibility. Define food as God's love made nutritious. Right? Did you hear that? I want you to think that food is not a commodity. I want you to think that food is God's love made nutritious. Now that sounds a bit bizarre. Why should Christians think this way? Well, you have to understand it this way. God creates a world for what reason? We believe, as Christians, that God's life is perfect in itself. God didn't need to do anything. God wasn't lonely. God wasn't deficient. And so when we ask, why does God create anything at all? The only answer that seems to be satisfactory is that God loves, and that God desires for something other than God to be. And then, importantly, God doesn't just create something. God is hospitable, which is to say that God welcomes what God has made into God's own presence, and in that presence nurtures that life, so that it can be fully itself. So when God creates, God is in fact making God's own love material. So one way to describe this is to say that the whole of creation is God's love variously made visible, auditory, fragrant, tactile, and delicious. I think you might understand a little bit what I'm talking about if you are a cook yourself. When I was a youngster, I had a grandmother who loved to feed me. Any of you have a grandmother like that? Sometimes I would show up at her place, and she'd say, "Norman, I have some food for you." And I'd say, "Oma, I can't eat. I just finished eating. I am full." And she'd say, "No, sit down and eat." And I'd say, "I cannot eat. I am stuffed." And she'd say, "Eat." And if I didn't eat, she would cry. Now, there might be some manipulation going on there. I don't know. But it's communicating something very important. When she cooked for me, she wasn't just saying, "Let me throw some calories in front of you." What she was putting in front of me was her own love for me made in the form of a donut, made in the form of a sandwich. If you cook, you know this. When you make a meal for somebody, if you're intentional in your cooking, you do it as an expression of your love. Which is why when we are at a loss on what to do, we provide food. When somebody dies, what do? You bring food. Because food is the most direct, visceral expression of our love for each other. Food is the communication that we don't want you to feel alone. We want you to know that you are being supported and cared for in the most basic need that you have, which is to make sure that you can keep living. And so cooking is this expression of our love for each other. It's our very mundane yet profound way of participating in God's own hospitality with the whole world. If this is true, then food is not fuel. Food is fellowship. When we cook for each other, when we eat with each other, one of the things that we are trying to communicate, sometimes very imperfectly, is we're trying to communicate something about the love that has brought the world into being, that daily sustains the world in its being, and that is the hope that someday we won't have hunger anymore. We won't have loneliness anymore. Because when you look at who this God is that we worship, we discover that God is fundamentally a cook. God provides food for all the creatures. Ask yourself this question: why did God create a world in which creatures have to eat at all? Why didn't God create a world in which creatures just simply are? They don't have to eat. It would have been an easier world because the love of God that creates and makes food available, this love is not simple or easy, because one of the very difficult truths, and again, this is something that's hidden from us when we are simply the consumers of food, is that for any of us to eat, others have to die. That's a downer, I know. Sometimes when I have people over for dinner, and if I've had meat in the menu, and I might say, "And thank you, Lord, for this chicken that died so that we can eat," and people will say, "Oh, I don't want to eat anymore." As if it's a surprise. Really? You thought chickens were just there and didn't die so you can eat them? So, as eaters who want to share in the love of God, we have to understand that this is hard reality. And so when we eat together, when we try through our eating to extend God's love in the world, we don't do it naively. We do it in such a way as to keep in mind that we have to become worthy of the life and death of others when we share and extend life with each other. And so the question is, how do we become worthy of this life and death that we receive and that we try to share? And here I think Jesus is instructive. I want to draw to your attention a passage. This is in John chapter 6. It's an amazing passage. I'm sure you know it already. It's one of those stories where Jesus feeds several thousand people. People have gathered, they follow Jesus around because there's something about him that makes people want to be with him. And they're out in the country, and they've been with him for a while, and people are getting hungry. And the disciples say we should send them off somewhere so they can go get their food. But Jesus says, no, we need to feed these people. And the disciples wonder, how's that going to be possible, right? There isn't a food truck rodeo going on down the street. So they find this boy who's got some loaves of bread and some fish. This was a good mama for this boy, right? Because the boy wasn't by himself going to eat all this food. The mama packed enough to share. But not enough to share for several thousand people. And so we're told that Jesus, in blessing the food, made enough food possible for everybody to eat, and there's a whole bunch left over. The people, they're astounded. And we're told that they rushed upon Jesus to make him king. And you can see why. Because for people who live on more or less intimate terms with hunger, having somebody as your king who can provide food on demand, who wouldn't want a king like that? But Jesus says, that's not who I am. I'm not your eternal grocer. He says something really startling. He says, I'm the bread of life. And then he gets kind of disgusting because Jesus says, unless you eat me. And the Greek verb here is tregein, which means to chomp and chew. In other words, you have to masticate on Jesus. How many of you are excited by that image? Because Jesus says if you don't have any life. You might exist, but you don't know what life is. Why is Jesus talking in this really puzzling way? I think it's like this. When we eat normal bread, even the really good stuff, it goes into you and is dissolved. It becomes the nutrition that makes it possible for you to live. It's wonderful. But Jesus, as the bread of life, is different because unlike bread that is digested, Jesus, as the bread of life, enters into you, and while inside of you, at this most visceral gut level, Jesus transforms you from within. And what is this transformation for? Jesus has to transform us so that we now live the life that he makes possible. And it's a life of what? It's a life of love. It's a life of nurture. It's a life of healing. It's a life of reconciling. It's a life of becoming friends with people who don't have friends. So when Christians eat Jesus as the bread of life, what they are doing is they are asking to learn to no longer simply consume everything around us. Instead, they are being asked to learn how to offer themselves to everything. In the life of love, in the life of service. When we eat Jesus as the bread of life, we are asking to become different kind of people. We're asking to become the kind of people who live in the world not in a rapacious manner, not in an exploitative manner, not in a hoarding manner. Instead, we ask to be transformed to be the sort of people who give themselves to others. In other words, Jesus becomes our food so that we can become food for others. And I'll end with just an image for you to see what I'm talking about. I grew up farming in southern Alberta, and my grandfather was somebody who farmed with us. He had already retired from his farm, but he couldn't stay away. He loved land, he loved his fields, he loved the animals. We had chickens, and every day from spring until fall, after lunch, he would grab a bucket and a scythe, and he would go and cut some grass down, put it in the bucket, and he'd walk to the chicken coop. Now, our chickens, they were free range. They could go wherever they wanted. We didn't know to call them that at the time. And the chickens knew what was happening because this happened every day. And as he got close to the chickens, they would come running. Have you ever seen a chicken smile? They smile. And he would throw the grass in the air, and these chickens would jump for joy and gobble up the grass. I look back on that and I'd say, why in the world would he have done that? Because these chickens could get their own grass. But my grandfather understood that if he's going to eat chicken, which he did, he first had to give himself to their care. And he did that not in the sort of shrewd or very frugal or stingy manner of just throwing the food down on the ground for them. He believed that if he's going to be a chicken eater, he has to make sure the chickens are happy and cared for. In other words, he had to love these chickens. He had to offer himself to the chickens. Contrast his way of raising chickens with the way we do it today. For us, chicken happiness doesn't matter. We're in the chicken destruction business. The love of God transforms everything. Because the love of God creates the world that we need to live. The love of God creates the food we need to live. And it's the love of God that will help us learn to care for the food that we need to eat. And caring for the food, we will also learn to care for each other. Thank you.
Well, I don't know about you, but I think I want to live in Dr. Wirzba's world. And I'm hungry for apple pie. So tonight at 7 p.m. at Emmanuel Episcopal Church, Dr. Wirzba will be speaking again. And if you have any questions or would like to speak with him, please feel free to come up and talk. Thank you.